So this is the last part for Unit 1, and we're going to talk about the evidence for evolution. There are four main types of evidence for evolution. We're going to talk about comparative anatomy, embryology, fossils, and molecular biology. So the first one we're going to talk about is comparative anatomy. Scientists compared structures between organisms. So when we're trying to look at whether organisms are closely related or even distantly related, we're going to look at these structures. And there are three classifications of types of structures. So there's homologous, analogous, and vestigial. When we talk about homologous structures, this is where Darwin suggested that these organisms all share our common ancestors, and that there have been additional changes to the design of that limb. So what we're basically saying is the structures come from the same common ancestor, but they are anatomically similar and are called homologous structures. Homologous structures, the structure is the same function. So what I'm trying to say here is the anatomy is the same, but the function is different. So when we look at this example here, we can see these four limbs of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. So if we notice here, okay, they each have one bone at the top of their arm. They have two bones in their lower bone or lower arm. And then we have all these little bones here called carpals in the wrist. And then we have right here, those are the metacarpals. Oops, I kind of got in there a little bit. And then we have these ones just are really small to see. And then lastly, we have those phalanges, right? The fingers. Now notice, so they are structurally the same, but they are used for different functions, right? A human arm is used for grasping items. A cat is made for jumping and catching prey. A whale is for swimming, and a bat is for flying. So same structure, different function. And what I mean by function is they have a different role, a different purpose. So here is again an example of when we talk about homologous structures. So this is with insects. So insects, when we look at the wings are all made of the same type of body part. It's an exoskeleton. Okay, so we can see where they share a common ancestor. So their structures are the same. Their functions in this case are the same too, right? For flying, right? So they don't necessarily have to be have a different role. Analogous, on the other hand, means that they have the same job. They do the same thing, same function, but they are different structures. Insect wings versus birds and bats. So when we look at that, we can see here that, let me move myself. We can see here that a bat wing and a bird wing and an insect wing, they're all going to be used for flight, okay? But they do not have the same structural organization. And in fact, we have true bones in the bat and the bird wing. Notice here the bird wing has two bones down here. And the insect wing has no bones, right? This one has no bones because again, it's an outgrowth of the exoskeleton. So what I'm trying to say here is that they are not common ancestors. They do not share a common ancestor. Here's another one I like to show. I actually have these to demonstrate in my class. So here we have a turtle shell versus an armadillo shell. So again, both of those structures are used for protection, to be protected against predators. But the turtle shell is an outgrowth. You can see here, it grows out of the vertebrae. So if you take a shell off a turtle, you're literally ripping its backbone out. Versus the armadillo, that is modified skin cells. So it's keratin. So it's kind of like made up of your hair and nails. So very different, made differently, completely made differently, but it's used for the same purpose. Now, vestigial structures are structures that are either no longer used or maybe reduced and then can't do what their original purpose was. So if we look at an ostrich, yes, ostriches have wings. They do not fly. Right? Now, they do provide shelter and shade for their offspring. So they've kind of been repurposed. As you know, penguins don't fly either. Their wings have been modified for swimming. Here is some vestigial structures in humans. We know that humans, we do not have a tail, right? But we do have the remains of a tail right here, the coccyx, the tailbone. And we also see these appendages here, the pelvic girdle, and then we have the hind limbs on a snake. And as you know, they don't use those anymore as well. And here is a whale. Okay, upon further investigation, when we look at whales, they have the remnants of a pelvic girdle, which would imply that they came from a four-limbed ancestor. And as we know, mammals were evolved on land. So, we're going to talk about that process through this course. But their whales' ancestors lived on the land and then they moved back into the sea. And as they progressed through millions of years, of course, those organisms that had reduced back limbs had less drag and were more efficient swimmers. And so over time, those structures became smaller and smaller until we only have these internal remains called vestigial structures. The second type of evidence for evolution when you look at is comparative evolution. Comparative embryology. So when we look at embryos, it's it's kind of really surprising to see that many embryos have look the same. And when you look at these early embryos, you may not be able to tell what species it actually is. But we do know vertebrates. So in that group, vertebrata, we do see these particular characteristics in all vertebrates. So any animal with basically a backbone, their embryos will have these same structures. They're going to have these, what we call pharyngeal gill slits, which are right here, 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 and here. Here's our tails, right here, 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 and there's our tail. Okay. And they also have what's called a notochord. The notochord will run down the back. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's a spinal cord, but it's a structure that helps support the spinal cord. And what we have found is that even though that we all share this common developmental pattern, that means that we clearly have some kind of common ancestor. When we look at this, all the gills have become, well, actually not all these slits have become ear canals. Some of them have become structures in the throat and the jaw. So here's this is a better picture here when you look at the embryos and you can see them, and you can see all the different, especially up here, I would not be able to tell which one's a pig or a turtle or human or a lizard. But as development moves forward, we can clearly see that they have diverged in their developmental patterns. The third thing that, and most of you guys are familiar with this as well, and that's fossils. We use a lot of fossils. There are all kinds of different types of fossils. So you guys are probably most familiar with, the basic where, an animal dies and then its remains are fossilized. The cells are replaced by minerals. And then we have different ways that we can, sometimes it's just the imprint left in mud, which would be like a mold fossil. It's the imprint, an impression in the mud that hardened into rock. We also have some different types of, we look at imprints and then whole body fossils. And then, you guys know this one here. This is amber from your Jurassic Park. So there are insects primarily that get trapped in tree sap that hardens over time into amber. So like I said, fossils are found in sedimentary rock. So sedimentary rock are rock that little tiny pieces, like I said, generally when they're underwater, that little tiny pieces of rock will get embedded and replaced the cells and the tissues and all that of that organism. So once we see that, again, the rock that's been eroded away and carried by water or wind, it takes approximately 10,000 years for an organism to become fossilized in this process. So here is a plant fossil. Everybody wants to talk about animal fossils, but we have plant fossils too. All right. So the fossil record does support the idea that as we move closer to the surface, animals become more complex. Transitional fossils, these are fossils that show the links between different organisms. And we have actually a few very famous transitional fossils. Nicholas Steno actually came up with the law of superposition, and that's where he was saying that the top will have the newer fossils. All right. So those of you that are not my age or X generation, so what we have here is a record. Now you guys know records are way back in time here compared to a tape. This is a cassette tape. Right. And then over time, we've developed, our technology has become better. And then newer would be our CD. And then up here, of course, you'd have to put like iTunes, YouTube, the cloud. Okay, so that would be up at top, right? The way we listen to music. Now, we also have this concept of relative age. And like I said, what we're saying is the further we use that color, we go down in the rock layer, the further back in time. Okay, and so if we can date certain layers, then we know fossils also found in those same layers are the same age. Okay, that's what relative age is. This is one of the most famous fossils called Archaeopteryx. If we look at Archaeopteryx, this is a link between reptiles and birds. You can see here the claws on the wings. These are feathers. These are all imprints of feathers. We have some feathers here on the tail. We have this long neck, and then they also have teeth. Okay. Tiktaalik is relatively new. I mean, not new in the sense of time because it's 375 million years ago, but we did just find this in 2006. And we actually found that up in northern Canada. Okay. Now, the link here was between the transition between fish and amphibians. There were different structures in the neck. Notice the fins have been modified to hold it upright and to get it out of the water. So this was a very, very significant transition fossil as well. So again, we haven't found all the fossils. Not all organisms form fossils. So there are some gaps in looking at these changes over time with all of the diverse organisms on our planet. Here is some of the fossils. We always look at whales. I don't know why we look at whales, but whale evolution is really kind of cool. So when we look at that ancestor, okay, that most likely was started, like I said, it started on land. The nostrils are up front. Okay, and if you think about that, most mammals, right? Like think of a raccoon or a dog or a possum. Okay, the noses are, where their noses should be. Okay, and then over time, 25 million years later, okay, notice it starts to move back. And we go forward even more. I don't know how many millions of years. It's at the top of their head, and we know that as the blowhole. Okay, so we have seen that transition We also have noticed the transition with the jaws to go along with their diet. So lots of different things that we've seen with whales, and whales are mammals, right? They're mammals in the ocean. The fourth type of evidence we use is biochemical evidence. And this is where in this age we use DNA. Okay. There's a lot of controversy on how to use it, but we all agree that this is a very good tool to use. So this is where we see the I don't want to say unification, but we can see where life is all related. Okay. All organisms on the planet use the same nucleotides: adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. And we'll get into that a little bit later. They all use what's called a triplet code. That triplet code gives us the information for 20 amino acids. Okay. With those, that's how we make proteins. Your body is all made up of all proteins. And so we can look at different proteins and we can see where they are very similar. The code for those proteins are almost identical in some cases from on different organisms. And so those DNA sequences can show those similarities of those different types of genes. So for example, if we look at cytochrome C is found in the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is responsible for making ATP. ATP is the molecule that makes energy. Okay, that's your energy currency in your body. All organisms use ATP. So it makes sense that that protein, cytochrome C, would be very similar. And so by looking at that, we can put a timeline where organisms kind of have diverged from one another. Here's another look at that. So instead of looking at the DNA and the bases, we can look at the actual amino acids. So if we look at these comparisons, like between us and chimps, our cytochrome C protein is identical. Okay, we can go back further. Along with rhesus monkeys, there's one. So we are least related to yeast, okay, and most closely related to, the chimpanzees, the primates, right, which makes sense. And then here's just a piece of some of hemoglobin. That's another thing, organisms have blood. They use the primary protein inside your red blood cell is hemoglobin, and that allows you to carry oxygen. And so we can compare those bases and we can see how this one's different here and this one's different. Notice the chimpanzee and the human is lysine, leucine, histine. They're the same. So there's just a big kind of debate on, should we look at DNA? Should we look at the amino acids? Should we look at the whole genome, all the DNA from the individuals, or just look at certain proteins? So there is still a debate, conversation on the best way to use this tool to classify organisms and see their evolutionary relationships with one another. And then we have biogeographical. Biogeographical is where we can see relations between organisms where they lived or once lived. Organisms tend to have characteristics that help them in their specific environment. And so we know, and I'm going to talk about this throughout the next few units, how the continents have not always been where they are currently. And so we can see these migratory paths for these organisms. So for example, for this particular organism in the Triassic here, we would find remains in Africa and South America. And it's really weird to see some of these remains here in Antarctica because it's not down in the South Pole. So we can see how these organisms either, migrated or were related, or how their common ancestors are found now in separate continents. Yeah. So that's kind of an important thing that we look at. All right. So that is it. So if we were to go, let's see if I can do this. we were to go back and just kind of summarize what we were doing, we were looking at those four main types of evolution. So we talked about the types of comparative anatomy, we talked about embryology, we talked about fossils, and molecular biology. So these are the four main types of evidence we use to support the theory of evolution. This is the last part in this unit, so make sure you do your reading assignment, and then you have your quiz to take. Do make sure that you stay within your time limit, and because it will submit automatically, and make sure that you're in an environment where you can have that time where you're not going to be interrupted to complete those tasks. Good luck on your quiz, and I will see you in Unit 2.